It's my very great pleasure to welcome you all to the Courtauld this evening for tonight's Research Forum event to celebrate the launch of my wonderful colleague and former British Academy Postdoctoral Award holder mentee, Dr. Bergit Arends, and her new book, Photography, Ecology and Historical Change in the Anthropocene, Activating Archives, which has just been published by Routledge in a book series, Photography, Place, Environment, edited by Professor Liz Wells, whom we're also delighted to have with us tonight, and whom I shall hand over to in a moment to say a little bit more about the book series. And I think there's another author from the series here as well this evening, so welcome. But first I want to introduce the author herself, Dr. Arends. So I first became acquainted with Bergit in 2018 when she contacted both myself, then director of the Centre for Black Humanities at the University of Bristol, and my colleague, the environmental historian Dr. Mariana Dudley, then one of the co-directors of the Centre for Environmental Humanities at the University of Bristol as well. And Bergit wished to find out whether Mariana and I might jointly be interested in mentoring her British Academy postdoctoral fellowship application with a project entitled Roots into the Anthropocene, an interpretive method for 50 years of art and environment artworks, 1970 to 2020. Mariana and I were both enthusiastic, and we worked with Bergit to develop her application, which was subsequently funded, which was no mean feat in the face of stiff competition for such awards, particularly British Academy Postdoctoral Awards, where a teeny tiny percentage are funded each year. So it's a testament to the intellectual integrity of Bergit's project. Prior to the award of her British Academy Fellowship, Bergit had been Doctoral Reed Scholar in the departments of Geography and Drama, Theatre and Dance at Royal Holloway, University of London, and she also holds an MA in Curating Contemporary Art from the Royal College of Art, as well as having studied conservation of works of art on paper at Camberwell College of Arts. Her doctoral thesis, Contemporary Art, Archives and Environmental Change in the Age of the Anthropocene, of 2017, resulted, amongst other things, in the publication of her book, Chrystel Lebas, Field Studies, Walking Through Landscapes and Archives. You can see a recurrent pattern here in Bergit's interests in archives and ecology and the Anthropocene. And the book, the Chrystel Lebas book, received the Krasner-Krauss Foundation Best Photography Book Award of 2018. Bergit's also a curator and has curated many international contemporary art projects for natural history museums in London and Berlin. Too many really to itemise here because obviously, we want to get to the main event, which is I'm talking about in the book. But yes, some of which might come up in panel discussion as well. Bergit's initial postdoctoral inquiry to both Mariana and myself is indicative of the ways in which she thinks laterally and expansively about her fields of inquiry. The focus on the intersection between environment and race through an analysis of art was a gift to Mariana and myself, and I think those initial Bristol years laid a solid foundation for Bergit's subsequent work, particularly when she decided to move with me to the Courtauld in 2021. It's a testament to Bergit's perseverance and determination that, despite COVID lockdowns completely curtailing her research travel plans in 2020, my move from Bristol to London in 2021 and the concomitant shift in the structure of how her British Academy project would be mentored, she not only completed the fellowship in a timely manner, but she also delivered its promised outputs in lightning fast time, a testament to her energy, intellectual curiosity and commitment. So, as her very proud mentor, and delighted to be chairing tonight's Research Forum event, with such a stellar lineup of guests, whom I shall hand over to Bergit to introduce in a moment. But before I do, I would first like to hand over to Professor Liz Wells to tell us a little bit more about the Routledge book series, Photography, Place, Environment, of which she is overall series editor, and in which Bergit's book has just been published. So congratulations, Bergit, and thank you, Liz. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dot. And we keep mentioning Chrystel, and she walked in just as you were mentioning her, so she's there, and was a minute ago on the screen. So, Photography, Place, Environment has had a slightly checkered history, but it's settling now. It's in 2016, I was approached by Bloomsbury Academic to propose a series, and that was wonderful because I could play around with ideas and eventually settled on photography, place, environment, because I'm, of course, interested in the interrelation of photographic practices, geography, place, and a sense of place, and environmental issues. And it has allowed the series to develop sort of in a tentacular sort of way. The first titles came out, December 2018 and January 2020, and you see from the titles something of the range that's beginning to develop. In early 2020, Bloomsbury handed the series over to Routledge. I was already working with Routledge anyway, so that was great. The bit that was not so great was we then all got locked down, and indeed the books got locked down in a Bloomsbury warehouse, and Routledge couldn't access them. So it was a bit checkered, but happily, in the first week of lockdown, we had the series launch, or rather, we didn't have the series launch. So the series launch eventually happened in May 2022. But now I think we're on more of an even roll. So we have 4 titles already out. Bergit's title is the 5th title. The 6th title is coming out at the end of this month, and Parvati Nair is somewhere in the audience here. And I'm working with 3 further potential authors right this moment. So what is the series about? It's for publishing original scholarship. Well, you can read it for yourselves, I think, from the back. And also, it hasn't come up on the screen here, so I can't read it. It really can be wide-ranging. You can find out more about it on the Routledge website. And more particularly because there are a list of possibilities that I could let you have. You could find out more about it by emailing me at ewells@Plymouth. So the 6th book and the 7th book is due out next year. The purpose of this, though, is to talk about Bergit's research. And you might wonder why I want to be a series editor. Well, the great thing about being a series editor is you get to work very, very closely with people on research that they have, about which they have extensive knowledge and that they're excited about, and they're trying to formulate in terms of a communication. So you're discussing your reading chapters. I have actually read all of Bergit's book, and I don't know how many other people in the room have done so. And I think I've read it all about 3 times. But isn't that fantastic? It's a fantastic privilege. So if any of you are interested in publishing under the series, please contact me, because I really enjoy working with people on projects that interest me. And I want to say congratulations to Bergit for all the work and a wonderful publication, which I'm sure you'll all enjoy when you get your hands on it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dot, for the introductory words. I am very moved by that, and it's been a really, really nice place to be here, just to have moved from Bristol, and strange we can't have Marianne here today, because she couldn't come. But thank you very much, and also thank you so much, Liz, for the kind words, also for the invitation to be part of this this excellent series of books, which to me, having done my PhD studies in the geography department as well, it resonates so well with so many areas of interest. And I know that you at some point thought about calling the series photography, geography, and the environment. And and you opted for place, but I equally felt at home in the series or have the name geography in it. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak here at the Courtauld. When I was thinking about tonight's event, and I felt slightly anxious about, a book coming into the world. There's been so many years of research going into it, so many contributors, and this sort of the sense of feeling slightly anxious about it took me back to also to thinking about the Anthropocene. Really, it was the age of the Anthropocene, which to me also exudes an anxiety there is in the relationship between humans and the natural world, which expresses itself in the sort of symptoms that we all experience in thinking about changing climates, biodiversity loss, and then the necessity and hopefully empowerment towards more environmental justice that comes with addressing these issues, as well as what comes also as a consequence of the decolonization of what we know about the natural world and how we know it. So my engagement with this topic of the Anthropocene, if I just start with that, really goes back to a time where I spent a lot of time in Berlin, and I'm really grateful also for the House of World Cultures of having initiated a major and various shapes and formats continuing project around the Anthropocene, bringing people together in a multi-disciplinary research environment. Later on also the Anthropocene campus, where you think about how you translate a lot of these issues raised into actions, into learning. And at the time I was curator of contemporary art at the Natural History Museum, which was such a privilege as well to be there. I was in there the period from 2005 to 2013, and then the program was made redundant because natural history museums didn't think that culture or contemporary art was part of the natural world and natural history. So there were places for me to go, and the House of World Cultures in Berlin was one of them. And it was a great place to be in order to more broadly to reconsider what is nature and to whom. And when I was thinking about all of this history of my own history, and also how the Anthropocene, and I know it's a contentious proposition as well, and we can talk about that, how it has but re-energized a lot of these debates, these bigger topics that we experience. And it brought me back to this image here, which I've always loved. Is a still from a work by French filmmaker Chris Marker. It's called La Jetée, and without wanting to go too much into the story of this film, I just want to show you this still image of two people peering into a display of the natural world. It actually happens to be the Natural History Museum in Paris, but it's like London, it's like Berlin, and it's like New York, and like many other places in the European and Anglo-European world, which has studied the natural world in a very particular way. And so these European ideas of nature is what I grew up with, and where I was embedded at the Natural History Museum. And the idea of living beings, living entities, organisms being removed from the natural world to be collected, archived, and displayed and studied in this particular way, held a lot of curiosity and intrigue for me. And the possibilities to study the moments in time, in particular to link extended periods of time, what, after all, a natural history museum or international museum collections afford, of going into depths of time which are way beyond living experience of humans and memories. But as a curator of contemporary art, and I was curious about these particular collections of nature, European institutions, and what these embody, and then how I, as a curator of contemporary art, could work with contemporary artists to unravel a lot of these questions that are embodied in the archives, and for me also to work quite closely as a curator, work quite closely with artists to travel back and forth in time. And notably for this project here, excitingly to me as well, to travel between being in the field and working within the archives as well. So to have that sense of being outside and being inside, and to witness and study questions of environmental and with that historical changes. So the book, it explores the connections between photography, particularly archives, ecology, and historical change. And I've come to call it in the presence of the narratives of the Anthropocene. And I'm so grateful that we have this celebration here today, and to all of those who supported me in my research. This is also to celebrate you and your all of those who are too numerous to name, and how grateful I am for their advice and their thinking, and for those who have been so generous in giving access to their work, studio spaces, being allowed to do field work with artists, and those who give access to archives, sometimes quite tricky to access, those archives which have got an organized structure, and I also love those archives which are in basements and stuff is underneath beds and in the sort of cavernous spaces, unordered and so on. So that has been really wonderful. And all those who've given their very specific expertise in the field and in the lab, and there are very many. So I'm also grateful for the Courtauld to be able to have this event today, to Matilda and Diego who organized it, and for you for joining today. It's been really quite wonderful. So archives then provides really compelling insights. They're not just an emotional investment that I have with them, but they provide compelling insights into environmental changes and also the ideologies and cultures of nature, as well as their vulnerabilities. And interestingly to me, the responsibilities for and those who are affected by environmental change. So in the book, I have got a significant introductory chapter, methodological chapter, where I introduce the thematic areas, so photography in all its different forms, archives, ecology, and the themes of the Anthropocene and its critiques, and examines in depth contemporary artists' engagement with historic archives. That is the important part, and that's the activating part, which we will discuss about later as well. I go into length about how archives have come into being, what you call an archive, when does an archive begin and where does it end, and all of these speculations about their origins and the motivations of putting archives together, and how they have become mobilized and become immobilized for different purposes by contemporary artists now. Photography, and I'm not a photography historian as such, so all those forgive me, and I'm glad that it's picked up who invited me for this series. But they have a number of different roles in these processes of formation and transformation of the natural world and of archives. And my uses of photography here are sort of quite liberal, as sort of photographs as images and objects. To me, the photographic object is really important when they are canvas on paper or as glass negatives. Photography as scientific practice comes really into this book as a social practice to exchange and to communicate, and as an artistic practice for documentary purpose as well as what's called fine art photography. So these broad ideas around photography, they form the context for the exploration of the archives, which I'm looking at here, and the activations, how do you do that, and the role of photography in the artistic processes, of course. The aspect of the archive is really important to this book, and I'm playing around with the ideas of the archive in three ways, main ways really. So there is what you will be familiar with, the documentary archive holds it's a repository of documents and objects, historical repository as well. Then I'm also developing the idea of the environment as archive. So this includes the geological strata of an archive, its fossil materials which are embedded in it, as well as biosphere and atmosphere as a sort of as a way of thinking about the history of an environment. And thirdly and importantly, and I guess it also connects with the idea of the Anthropocene, which expresses human intervention into the natural world. There's also the human body and its memory capacity and the mnemonic processes of the human body, which is also understood as an archive. So these all slot together in a sort of this wider conception of the archive, and these diverse photographic processes are there to challenge histories of environmental change from a variety and diverse perspectives. So the idea for every chapter after this methodological chapter is that there are dialogues between contemporary artists and historic protagonists. So that's the nature of the dialogues, which I'm sort of investigating in 4 different case studies to demonstrate kind of the application of the themes that I've just briefly talked through. So to start with, the first case study chapter is called Archival Metabolisms. And it's about the landscape transformation that took place in the GDR, the German Democratic Republic period of the 1970s, where there was a great dependency on coal in order to fuel industries, and there was a great shortage of it, and the GDR mostly has got brown coal, which is very poor in generating energy. So there's a huge move towards the Leipzig area to take down villages and to expand the brown coal mining sites. And this project was really interesting to me because I was drawn to this as it was an exhibition at the Leipzig Art School, Art Academy, that was curated, and it was the first sort of look into artists who came over to the GDR in the time of various different changes. In the time of the social diplomatic networks, we invited artists from other socialist countries to come and spend significant periods of time, actually about 5 years in the GDR. So artists came from Mongolia, China, Vietnam, Hungary, sometimes even France and Belgium, and spent time in the GDR. And so I was particularly taken by this project by a Vietnamese photography who as a photographic practice, they work in a social documentary vein. And Nguyen the Thuc spent about a year researching this topic, spending time with people who were affected by these changes, and documented many different steps. And I met a lot of the people that he met, and he talked to me about their relationship with him, and there was a fieldwork I did in the Leipzig area. And together with that project, which I investigated itself, I also looked at how the project was displayed, and the archival exhibition that came out of the research that 2 curators did, Julia Blum and Heidi Stecker, resulted also in a commission by a contemporary artist called Christiane Eisler, who is therefore our contemporary pendant to the historic work of Nguyen the Thuc, who revisited some of the sites that he photographed, and so therefore documenting that particular environmental change, but also she's really interested in the social changes that came with it as well, and that are now experiencing, that was then 2014 in the GDR. So nothing exists in an isolated space, and we now know as well about those villages that are being demolished in the Cologne area to make place for more coal mining. We know about the political situation in the GDR now, and so it is embedded in those discussions and that thinking, and it maintains a currency which I found interesting and explore in my chapter. we have here a completely different project by artist Chrystel Lebas, who's sitting over there. It's nice that you're here. And who I got to work on a collection of what's called an orphan archive in the National History Museum. A couple of boxes of glass negatives have sort of fallen through the systematic system of the Natural History Museum, and with some investigation, are a really interesting testimony to environments of the British Isles of the early 20th century, but they're also part of a very little investigated history of photography, and particularly ecological photography. So the beginnings of ecology, how were these environments registered, photographed, and ecologists busy themselves of figuring out ways of photographing the environment and taking those images back into the lab. But I guess it was still very tricky to integrate ecological thinking and photography and imagery into the particular principles of the Natural History Museum. So they remained untouched for a long time until an artist could, and with a couple of adventurous botanists, could start investigating these sites which were shown on the images in the field. Here an image of work in Scotland, but in many different areas, and take these images back then to the lab. So the contemporary images and the historic images, and to look at how an environment might have been transformed, and how plant communities photographed in the field might be transformed into the collections principles of the Natural History Museum. Another ecologist became the interlocutor for contemporary artists. So here we have artist Dion, who considers himself a sculptor really, but he does really performative pieces on investigations of the natural world, often reperforming processes that scientists would have applied in investigating an environment and then transporting that into the Natural History Museum. So here we can see on the right Mark Dion reperforming a yard of jungle, which goes back to fieldwork by ecologist William Beebe, who visited the environment of Para in Brazil, and Mark Dion tried to investigate William Beebe's work, applied some of these ecological working methods, as you can see on the left, of the quadrat that you take from an environment and then you take it into the lab environment and investigate everything that you found in this square meter of the natural world. And he did this project as part of the Rio Earth Summit, so the UN Convention of 1992, which is a significant political environment for looking at the predicament of the natural world at the time, and sort of gave an opportunity to discuss the politics of this particular event in relation to a Brazilian natural environment, to the early 20th century, and then from his role to comparing it to now. And finally, the fourth case study, and there's also, we've got Joy Gregory here as well in the audience. She worked with composer Philip Miller on the historic works, and here we're going way back into the beginning of the natural history system, as it were, in the late 1600s. And Gregory and Miller investigated Hans Sloane's voyages to Jamaica, and Hans Sloane's work is foundational to the British museum world. The collection that Hans Sloane put together as foundational to the British Museum, and that later then became only the collection for the Natural History Museum. But interestingly, what they did was to look at the life of an individual, a named individual in Hans Sloane's book. And that individual was referred to as Rose, and is reperformed here, following the description of Hans Sloane. And so here we have embedded in an individual, a person, and Gregory and Miller trying to retrieve as much as possible about this one person within what was then it started the plantation economy that so relied on the exploitation and extraction from the natural world there, as well as the extraction of people from the African continent. So this is combined with very autobiographical aspects and the testimonies of those from Jamaica who migrated to the UK in the post-war period. So it gives insights through personal stories into observations of migration, but in conjunction with gardens and weather observations, and all of this in dialogue with an individual called Rose, who was described by Hans Sloane in his 1688 work. So these various case studies help to rephrase some of the historical junctures that we think of as important to describing natural history. They serve to review these responsibilities and vulnerabilities, and how we need to think natural histories otherwise through the activation of archives. And this is something where my scholarship sits in conjunction with many others. Scholarship is a dialogue, and this is a dialogue I'd like to open up today to my colleagues Beatrice von Bismarck and Lucy Breitman, who have kindly agreed to join me here today. So by way of short introduction, before I ask Lucy and then Beatrice to give some responses to the book. So Professor Dr. Beatrice von Bismarck teaches art history, visual culture and cultures of the curatorial in the Academy of Fine Arts Leipzig in Germany. She's worked as a curator of the Department of 20th Century Art at Städel Museum in Frankfurt. She was co-founder and co-director of the Kunstraum of the Universität Lüneburg, initiator of the MA program Cultures of the Curatorial, and co-directed the itinerant Transcuratorial Academy with manifestations in Berlin, Mumbai, and Phnom Penh from 2017 to 2018. Her recent publications, both in 2022, include the monograph The Curatorial Condition, and very interesting to me, archives on show, revoicing, shape-shifting, displacing the curatorial philosophy. I'm really pleased that you're here and we can discuss many aspects, I hope, of the book. And then Lucy Breitman is a specialist in modern and contemporary art in the United States, with a particular focus on histories of art in California and the American West, notably ecological and eco-critical histories of American art, and the intersections of art activism and radical theatre practice. Lucy is Dean of Research here and leads the Courtauld Strategic Research Agenda. We don't want to hear about that today. We want to know about your work. The academics. And she's also editor of the journal Art History. Lucy also convenes the MA Special Option Ecologies in American Art, 1950 to now, here at the Court. Thank you so much for joining. If I can ask Lucy first.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much, Birgit, for inviting me to speak this evening. I've been told 7 or 8 minutes, so I shall try and be brief. But really, thank you for your really wonderful book. which makes such an important contribution across multiple different fields and I think sits so beautifully at the intersection of so many current concerns in art history. So I want to spend the next few minutes briefly drawing out some of the themes and the imperatives that I took as I read the book really excitedly, and to relate them in some sense to my own thinking and teaching, which circles around the idea of art produced in what might be termed the age of ecology, particularly in the American context. And the question of what a form of ecological thinking and doing might offer either as art practice or as art historical practice. And as Bergit mentioned, I'm also the editor of the journal Art History, and I've been thinking as part of that editorship about some of these questions and the lessons that we might learn from an ecological mode of thinking for the practice of art history. And it's been core to my strategy there to really champion work like Bergit's that embraces a kind of cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary thinking around questions of environment, ecology, and climate. And in my mind, as I read the book, several key terms kept sort of swirling around to describe the sorts of procedures that you pull out so beautifully and with such methodical research labour, and I'll come back to that idea at the end, and that sit at the intersection of photography, ecology, and the archive. And I found particularly exciting the way in which you thought very expansively about that term archive through those three kind of different categories, which I think emerge as not distinct things, but as really deeply interrelated and interconnected: the idea of the landscape and the geological archive, the archive of paper and documents and collections of images, and the archive of the human body. And I think those three things kind of come together in really beautiful ways. The first theme that I wanted to draw out was the way in which the practices that you delineate, Bergit, surface the kind of imbrication of imaging and imaging practices and technologies and the changing of environments and landscapes. The way in which images and photographs in particular have been embroiled in our perception or our construction of the idea of environment, landscape, nature, ecology, wilderness, through the modes of natural history, of geological survey, of aerial terrain mapping, and photographs of the Earth seen from space. And I brought with me an image that you mention as really kind of foundational to that sort of thinking, the image Earthrise, the first image of the Earth from space, the first moment that people were able to think and kind of visualize that planetary sense. And of course, the common use of repeat photography as a means to observe changing ecosystems, habitat loss, retreating glaciers, and I think we're all quite familiar with that, the kind of rhetoric of the photographic return as a means of charting what we are losing or really what we are destroying. And also, of course, of charting, absolutely related fashion, dispossessed, displaced, and disappeared beings, including human populations. What these examples remind us, and again I brought some images of a work that you discuss in that beautiful introduction, this project of re-photographing by Mark Klett, of returning almost to the kind of scene of the photographic crime to retake the same spot, the same landmarks years later. And what this kind of project reminds us is that anthropogenic environmental change is inextricably and ideologically linked to photographic depictions of it, so that those photographic depictions don't just show us something after the fact, but they tell us how we are envisioning and how we are responding to and constructing environment and landscape along with those beings that inhabit it. And you put it, there's a kind of wonderful moment where you describe that process of construction You write, nature becomes constructed through the culture of science and the scientific adventurer. So that science is also a practice complicit in that process of constructing our understanding of nature. And I think that process, and we might draw this out, is also one that's historically really gendered, the idea of the scientific adventurer who is using photography to kind of construct this idea of nature. There's also a sense, and this again was kind of playing in my mind as an art historian, that the return to rephotograph as a means of capturing and comparing is not entirely separate from the comparative photographic traditions of art history as a discipline, which emerged in the early 20th century as a discipline that placed images alongside each other to look for similarities and differences. The kinds of projects like the one that we see on the screen is in effect a kind of art history. And here's another one that reminds us, of course, that change in the landscape is not just one of loss and disappearance, but is also one in which man-made interventions into the landscape can change it really radically, so things like damming water. I also brought with me a work that is not in your book, but it really kind of put me in mind of a lot of the conversations that you were talking about, which again is a project of rephotography in which images taken on the US Geological Survey are revisited in Glacier National Park, I should say Glacier National Park, in a project that, by the artist Nicholas Brown, that really draws a link between the images and the kind of urge to re-photograph in order to show vanishing glaciers, and the way in which revisiting and rephotography also services histories of dispossessed indigenous people. That question of return, then, is the other kind of big word that circled through my head as I read the book. Return as in the kind of quest for an originary Anthropocenic moment that has shaped debates around terminology in the environmental humanities, to the kind of rephotographing project that I just spoke of, to contemporary artists' return to earlier histories and to their traces in archives, in collections, in cabinets, in drawers, perhaps in memories, and of course your own retracing of a lot of those projects. And I think one of the things I really enjoyed about your book in particular was the way that it made very visible and explicit your own retracing and your own project of return as art historical research. And as you outline it, this operation of return to a place, return to a time, return to a history, if only partial, permits those artists to make visible or explicit the social power relations and the violence that is brought about by environmental change and that acts on the world to bring about that change. So we have this pervading notion of return as really a deeply political act in describing and naming historical violence against environments, ecosystems, and also beings. And it's also political, I think, in the way that it reminds us of the pervasive and ongoing nature of that violence against ecosystems and beings. That is to say that the kinds of things that you're talking about, the artists are really showing us that those things, that change cannot be sealed off really conveniently in the historic past, that past is one that is pervasive and ongoing and alive. So there's a kind of sense, and I'm aware of time, sorry, of the sort of disruption that return enacts, the placing in proximity of past images and contemporary ones of past scientists, natural historians, photographers with contemporary artists and contemporary scientists, which invites us, I think, and again, these were words that circled in my head as I read your book, to think about identification and empathy. What does it mean to retrace, to inhabit, to re-witness? And how might this return shape not just our observation of change, but the potential for that change to be felt affectively in the body as a chain of relationships with other beings and other times. And I think your final chapter on the incredibly moving Seeds of Empire project really asks us to think critically about the question of archival return, how we depict loss or absence, what we do with gaps in the historical record or the archive, what we do with what is not captured or what has been rendered illegible. And I suppose in my mind, this juxtaposition invites us to read even just the caption of that image on the left and to think of that little indication of what is illegible in that piece of the archive, and to extrapolate to think about all of those things that are not represented or legible or present. Very finally, because I know I've absolutely run over my 7 or 8 minutes, the other term that kept circling around my head as I read your wonderful book was that term labour, and the work that has gone into the practices that you describe and your description of them, that must always shape, I think, and be surfaced in conversations around ecological and eco-critical art history. The labour that the artists took, the many visits, the years of study, the interviews with source communities, the field work, the expeditions, what read at times like pilgrimages or quests, the work of imagination and of empathy. Over and over again, there are moments where you describe this lengthy process of research, theirs and also yours. And with that in mind, I will just close by saying that that lengthy process of research on your part was absolutely worth it. This is a fantastic, magnificent book. And I think we all, those of us who have had the opportunity to read it, hugely enjoyed it. Those of you who haven't will learn huge amounts from it. And I know that it will be part of our discussions for many years to come. So thank you.
Completely different because it's a really great pleasure to be here. It's wonderful to have had not only the pleasure but also the need to read your book and have it as something that I found extremely inspiring for other things that I might be thinking about from there on. So first of all, thank you. Thank you for having invited me, and thank you for having made it possible that I can come and relate to your book. I related on a little bit of a different ground, and I think that's what you expected me to do, meaning from the curatorial point of view. And by that I mean from point of view of a practice that I consider to have a right on its own as a cultural productive process, and that I think also relates very much to the way that you looked at archives and at archival practices. And that with respect first of all to the relationality that you built up in relation to the different practices and to the different material that you saw in those assembled. And relationality not only with regards to things, but also with regards to the people. So every single element involved in the archives you were looking at, and the practices you were looking at, played a role in relation to one another, and did that with a certain kind of agency. And I think that for me was something that I could relate to from a curatorial point of view. An agency, as you made very clear in your introduction, not only in relation to the documents and to the documentary, but particularly, and that I liked in terms of the embodiment, in terms of the human body, as an archive that in its own right develops an agency in relation to all the other elements. Furthermore, I thought it's a book that I can very much relate to from the point of view of what are the conditions in which archives come into being and generate meaning. And we're so used to looking at archives as something that takes over control of the meaning production, but that it is something that processes meaning, like you called it activating a title, but one could see that the archives themselves start producing meaning through being looked at, through being approached, through being kind of handled in a different way. That's something that I can relate to very much from a curatorial point of view. And in that respect, I think we're talking about a practice. We're talking not only about the thing, the archive, but we're talking about the photography in relation to the archive, but we're talking about practices. So what you've just seen, thank you very much again, is a book that Bergit has already mentioned, Archives and Show. It's a book that, and I wasn't quite aware of the connection that we have to the HKW, the House of World Culture in Berlin, both of us, but this was done in connection with an activity or a long-term project of the House of World Culture in Berlin, set up called The Whole Life, nothing less but The Whole Life, and it was related to archives in an interdisciplinary, transcultural, multi-institutional way. Took for about 4 years at different venues, and in the end they asked themselves what remains of these 4 years. So they asked a group of people to produce 3 volumes that publish ideas that they got out of this 4-year project from the different points of view. So there was an anthropological approach, there was a literary approach, and mine was, of course, again, the curatorial approach. And what I did, the idea in the back of their minds was that if it's sustainable as a project, then it would be really nice if we could teach it. So if we could use it as a tool to look at approaches to archives from these different perspectives, and mine then was the curatorial. So what I did was to invite 22 contributors, artists, curators, and theoreticians, to use 2 double pages of the book as a curatorial space in order to develop their curatorial approach to archives from that point of view on the space of a book. So how can the book become a curatorial space? How can these spaces then develop into a glossary of different approaches? And as you can see, they're kind of wide ranging and maybe not immediately understandable, comprehensible as a curatorial approach, but what you can also see that if you start looking at these different activities, these different practices, they have a temporal, spatial, a transcultural, but a very much process-oriented and very much relationally oriented character to all of them. And you will find in them people who have written, Françoise Vergès, for example, for a long time about archival practices, in this case about non-material, but kind of immaterial relations to, or immaterial archives in general. But also maybe younger artists who might not call themselves artists with archival practice, but I considered them to have that, and they went along with me through the project. And what I would like to do is 2 things. I just kind of map out some of the issues that I relate also to your book, but then introduce 3 positions very briefly, why I think they might have something to do with what you also called an expansion of your attitude towards archival practice. So let me just start with the first one. What I understand by the curatorial, I think, is always a constellational activity. It's always something where different elements come together and relate to one another, and through this kind of activity, produce new relations, and that production of new relations generates new meaning. in a very short way described. Because it's an activity of reassembling, and I think that's exactly what you do with the book. It's a reassembling of different attitudes that themselves reassemble the material in a way. We have the chance of participating in different relations, and these different relations have a very social, political potential, because relations are what makes us tick, but they also are the way in which, for example, institutions relate to us, and we relate to institutions. Maybe we want to do that in a different way. So what we're used to with archives is usually something that has to do with control and stabilization and with perhaps preserving, while the curatorial adds to that this particular moment of differing from the original archive through the publicizing, through the dynamizing, through the process of meaning production. And finally, the agency that I mentioned already has a lot to do with that relation building process amongst all the participants. They all have an agency in that situation. It has a lot to do, and I think that I see in the book as well, what I would call the social life of things, so that the social life of things is not what, Arjuna Padurai's notion of it, which is that you do not look at things in terms of what they are, but more what they bring with them into the situation and cannot be thought. We cannot think of the situation without that. Let me end by this part by saying it all has to do with kurara, with the original meaning of the curatorial or of curating, and by that I mean that the building of relation of other relations is very much an activity that can be called ethical, because it's a caring dimension of relation building. It's caring for all the participants and all the relations that they enter into. So quickly, I show you, just to give you an idea of these double-page constructions, where the artists or the contributors generally are kind of really asked to put it together in a way that it's answering to, the elements are answering to one another as if they were in space. This Kapani Kivanga, this on the left-hand side is Yarabatana, the end of Yarabatana, and Shapeshifting, the beginning of Kaifatar. Just to give you an idea, and let me just stop here. This is Roger Bürgel and Sophia Prinz, Mobile Worlds, which was an exhibition in Hamburg at the Natural History Museum. And it tried to, no, it's not the left, it's the Arts and Crafts Museum in Hamburg. And what they did through the curatorial is put different perspectives that mobilized the different objects in terms of the trading routes, in terms of the imperial traces that you can find in the ways that the objects actually came into the museum. And they used the whole installation so that you could go around these objects and look through the vitrinas from different points of view in order to make clear that the entanglement of the single object was much stronger than you would usually have displayed it. So you had it always connected with one another in order to sort of show not only the aesthetic reasons, but also the violences, the subordinations, appropriations that this is actually a folder page, so you have all the pages that there were at the hand. I'm going to talk about Sarah Peers. I'm just quickly mentioning Kala Atya. You might be familiar with his work and the centrality that the mission of repair has for him. and in this case it's the objects interlacing project that he showed in Zurich. And I think what's interesting there is that, in relation also to your book, is that it's not about putting things together as if they had not been destroyed, but rather keeping the actually signs of destruction, the actual sign of deterioration visible and sort of comprehensible, or you do not want to undo them, but what you want is constantly come back to them, and through this coming back is initiate a moment of repairing the irreparable. And in that context, he invited, for example, Suleiman Bashirian, who is very eloquently talking about the restlessness of objects and the impossibility of ever repairing anything that has been destroyed. And I would like to end with a quote from Iman Issa for her contribution. It's coming up soon. Just gives you an idea. Parallelizing. So this is Iman Issa's project. Just one page, unfortunately, not the double page. But let me read out 3 things. I know I'm probably far beyond any time. Let me read out to you what she thinks about the impossibility of repairing in a way. 3 short sentences. Assuming the relationship between the object in the world and the one in the museum as a matter of a loss of depth implies that it would again be feasible to conceptually extract the object from its new surroundings in the museum and link it to its former self with, I quote, the higher resolution that was in the outside world. That's how she starts it. But could it not be that once an object enters the museum, it becomes impossible to separate it from its new habitat without completely altering it? And that the far more poignant and less violent display is the one that takes this into account. A display that stresses the gap to the outside world as opposed to trying to eclipse it. And she finishes, a curatorial handling of these artifacts will then require a light hand, an act of active listening to them and what they need. It might also require unusual methods when displaying these artifacts. For example, an object may need to be partly or wholly covered, hidden, replaced or altered in a variety of manners. It may even, under the conditions, contently allow itself to be called out. And maybe that's a perspective that we can also use for your book.
Thanks very much. Shall we just sit down here? I think we should maybe not have this.
Thank you all very, very much for those really evocative insights into how you're responding to Bergit's book and how your own work speaks to some of the themes of the book. And we're all kind of acutely aware of the time, but it was really great to let our speakers, I think, speak about their practices and their thoughts and their responses. So what I thought what we thought we'd do is throw it straight open to the audience, actually. So you've got time to ask questions of our panelists as well. So, yes, there's a question back there, Elena. Hi. Oh, there's a roving mic, so yeah, if you could just hold on until the mic comes your way, that would be great. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask why you conclude the book, I haven't seen all the chapters, the structure, but why conclude with seeking empire? It feels like so much of the way we perceive and relate to the landscape is informed by these related histories and legacies.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
They turned on those mics.
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You might have to press a button.
Thank you for that question. It's a good question. I mean, how do you order chapters in a book? And it's kind of a curatorial task almost. It's just how you get chapters to talk to each other. What do you encounter first when you are the reader is probably the first case study chapter, and you go through it in sequence. You don't have to, but as it was, I put together the first chapter, on the GDR situation and the Vietnamese artist engaging with the community first. Is that colonial as well? I don't, there's an aspect to that. I think I wouldn't solely reserve the colonial imperial aspect to the final chapters of empire. So I think that it was in a way to preempt that sense. It was a good flow for the book because I put together the two middle chapters because they both respond to ideas of ecology. So that's why they sort of sit together. However, I think it's a good point, and I think what I did when I edited the book and I kind of wrote it is a sense of colonialism is sort of pervasive in all of the chapters in a way. It's sort of it's never far away, and I think there were some passages which I rewrote as well with that in mind. So kind of the last chapter, which happens to be the final one, kind of informs the other ones, because I don't think we can think of the natural world as we know it through a European lens, through the Natural History Museum. We can't think it without histories of empire, colonialism, and trade. So I think it has to come into every single analysis that you do, even if it's not so made explicit. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else from the audience? Any questions or comments? Yeah.
I was really interested in using such very, very different mediums, looking at the body, looking at the environment, and looking at more traditional archives. And I wondered how you made sense, how you navigated such different landscapes in terms of comparing them and making sense of them as a cohesive whole when you thought about the book and in writing the book.
Yes, thank you for that. I think there's a lot of different methods in a way, and sort of that I could draw on in order just to, like interview techniques, field work, investigating the objects, appreciating other people's expertise, because there are limits to my expertise. What I know in terms of the study of the natural world is sort of very strong limitations. So it's also that those interconnections and collaborative elements which really come into it. But once you're kind of in it, I mean, there are some objects that also kind of a guide for this book, which I sort of have in my memory, which are not explicitly described in the book. But they always show these interconnections. So, for example, at the Natural History Museum, there's an object which is this size, it's called the Calendar Rock. And it's a accretion of minerals in a mine, and you have sort of whitish layers, and it's part of a coal mine. And then in between when you have got the mining happening and the coal dust settling, you have got this sort of fine black layers, and then you've got overnight, or you have got again accretion of those other minerals, and then when it's Saturday, Sunday, when there was no work going on, you have got a sort of thicker line. So, you can see there's some objects like that which kind of exemplify it, and then you see them and you realize there are other aspects to, we really cannot separate some of these. And, same actually when I did some work in the Leipzig area, there are people saying, well, we have lived here, and there was such a high level of pollution, air pollution. We said we thought we'd never see the sun again because the air was so polluted. So it's just, you have to just take all of these aspects into account and just find ways of integrating them. And that was the pleasure of it, really. But it suggested itself all along at every step. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, there's another question over there.
Hi. It's not so much a question, but maybe, we talk about the body in an archive, so it's just sharing a response, I suppose. I happen to have lived through Braunkohle, the kind of really low quality coal, which then, it's the pollution in the air is absolutely incredible. And it's very hard to breathe, it literally is. So it's sort of, that's kind of my bodily archive responding to this kind of archive. So I just wanted to bring that into the discussion in terms of the layering, the responding, and the kind of livingness of an archive or an activation. So this is activating the bodily archive I had actually forgotten. So I wanted to share that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really great actually, because I was just thinking as well, in the title of your book, who or what is activating the archives, right? And that's a really nice example of how that might be done. I don't know if there's anything else that you're thinking of when you're talking about that, when that's part of the title of your book, the subtitle. Whether you want to say any more about that activation.
No, really, thank you very much for that comment. Yeah. It was nice. I mean, when I worked in the area, I just I had fun investigating, meeting lots of people, being in sort of other environments, and then but also there's a lot of literature and films and so on, and all of this combines. I mean, actually, there's an aspect I wanted to do also. What Lucy said, what you said. I mean, the elements of time, of giving research time. I know we all want it, but it seems to be such an important element of, you talked about the relation aspects of the archive. You just need to give it time just to speak to people, bring people in, have sense of discovery, or sort of being in the landscape and working with the landscape and environment. So I just think, in a way, this approach to work is it's very difficult actually to do it, because you need the time and you need to have the generosity of people to access them and so on. So it's a kind of rare, almost to unusual, just to be able to do it. And you talked about the HKW and a 4-year project, and then they invite you, and then you go back to artists, and and you talked about some of your projects in ecology, and I know this. It's and I don't know, with regards to sort of curatorial practice or art historical practices, how does one do it? Is it's sort of time poor, and funding is so low often, just yeah.
So in relation to that and that idea of time, then, the kind of, although I sort of framed the book as the sort of culmination of your British Academy postdoc, in many ways, I think some of the themes and the ideas of this book are things that you have been thinking about for a very, very long time, right? Since your days curating to the Natural History Museum, clearly.
Yeah.
So for you, did it need, I mean, the book is the end result of a longue durée, really, a process, really. Do you want to speak a little bit more about that? And, what determined what you ended up selecting for the book and left out, and or not?
What about the strings left to have? Yeah, I know. I know there are colleagues from the Natural History Museum as well, which is great. We know it ourselves. If you getting to know this body of knowledge and the system and how it works takes such a long time. I always wondered, maybe I've just got one idea in my life.
That's okay.
Is one okay? Is
I think
enough?
one's enough.
Yeah, and it's
also to me, as your mentor, I always sort of thought of how quickly you turn things around. You were always writing and always producing things, and we have a different concept of your time. I noticed there was a question coming in the back there. Oh, it's two. Three, no, two.
I was just
three.
going to add something while we
Yes, so
move the
there's
mic, if that's
a lady
okay.
in the white jumper first of all,
Which is
and
just-
then the lady in the black jumper, and then a lady at the front.
I just wanted to add a thought, actually slightly in response to what you shared, which is that I think this really expanded idea of the archive and the body as archive invites us to think about how we share knowledge and the way in which we kind of share the archive of our bodies with each other. And it also encourages us to think about, I suppose, the archival encounter in quite a different way, that the archive is not necessarily something that we visit and we read, or it's not just that, but it's also something that we feel or that we remember. And the archive will mean different things to different people. So in some senses, there are archives that will be visible and legible to some and not to others. And I think it really kind of encourages us to think about research in a much, much more nuanced way, to think kind of beyond this image that we all have of like a building with boxes with documents, but actually, you know, that is not the only place that memories are held. And I think one of the really incredible things about the connections that you trace, which are material connections and temporal connections and spatial geographical connections and connections of practice, really encourage us to kind of think about the work that we do in a much more creative way, I think, and a much more embodied and ethical way, which really kind of comes out from reading the chapters together, maybe, and the whole thing kind of as a project and a practice.
Thank you. Question?
I was just going to ask, I haven't read the book yet or looked at anything in it, but Bergit was making sure 10 weeks and the best courses.
Sorry, can you speak up a bit? Is that working? Is the microphone up?
Yeah,
Yeah.
quite quiet. Yeah, no, I haven't read the book. I'm really excited to. Bergit was one of my teachers for 10 weeks, and she's one of the best teachers I've had in this entire institution. The way she thinks, the way she teaches, it's honestly changed my whole Again, talk about like archives and spaces, and I always pitch them as very flat editors or dusty little boxes. But where this will obviously end up in an archive, like what kind of archive would you like it to end up in, or what kind of change on the spaces you're in would you like? Would you like it to radicalize the Natural History Museum? Or
Yeah, actually, also maybe coming back to your question, what has been left out? I mean, there's a program I did at the Natural History Museum, of which I'm really proud, because it happened at the time where the Natural History Museum hadn't really thought about, or doesn't really put it out in its links to the history of science, to links to trade and empire. And there was a program I did working with artists from China and India and indigenous Australia, and to me that really was a turning point, which I hope would change the cultures of natural history museums. And that was I started that program 2009, 2010, and so on. So it's a challenge and a change to institutions which I like to see, and that's why I like to see these books as well. But then equally, you know, they are the archive of ecological photography. That sort of set there a little bit of, well, this is one way of looking at the world, but it doesn't fit with the systematics ordering system of the Natural History Museum. So it's also an interesting challenge, you know, of having an integration of plant communities in this way, which, you know, the Natural History couldn't work with. But to me, anyway, the decolonizing impetus, I think that's the one that's where I think needs to continue.
Thank you. And then there's a question behind. Yeah, lady in the black.
Hi. Christiane, I really liked what you said about how scientific photography is shaping the field of geological science and how this relationship is mimicked in the field of art history. As our relationship to image making has changed with computation and generative technology, how will the scientific archive function in the future?
Big question. Big question.
Yeah, it's a really actually that's it's a budding new research project of mine.
Watch this space.
So yeah, I will speak to me again, and hopefully 6 months time or something when I will know a little bit more about it. but it's really interesting. Also, what I'm hoping to look at as well is what the sort of descriptors are that we have around landscape. You know, how we put it in words, and you know what sort of the visual vocabulary it is of what relate to landscape, and that's why we like to work with AI in order just to develop that further, and how you can also develop future landscapes. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have another question down here on the second row from the front.
Me now?
Yes, you now. Thank you for your patience.
I'm just wondering, because in a way archives are kind of existing things, and they maybe really find themselves. But I'm wondering whether in your process of research, you, rather than just thinking about them deeply, whether you also learn to think about them differently, whether there was something in the process of research that really surprised you that you didn't expect when you started out.
Did everyone hear the question? Yeah.
Thank you.
But I don't know. Maybe I should let Beatrice go first and say something about the surprise. I mean, there's always something. I love the material culture of archives always, and so there's always something around there which I just find intriguing. And I don't know. Sorry, I was just did some work with Dot actually. She asked me to go to see an archive. That was just 2 weeks ago, and I was in Berlin, and we knew this was a private archive, and it's about the circus, and you know, and there are 2 private people who put this together, and I tried to imagine, you know, what would it be like? I go and press the bell at the door, and you know, how would he say hello, and how would it, and I could just imagine this whole living room situation, and the rustic oak table, and you know, and stuff everywhere. You know, I wasn't allowed to touch anything, and just sitting at this table with this couple who were so friendly, and so yeah, and because it was about the circus, he opened the door. And he greeted me, and he was wearing these leggings, and I thought, oh, he must have been a trapeze artist. And,
I'm glad Bergit went first.
He wasn't. But it was all incredibly charming and interesting, and he was the press officer of the GDR State Circus and had pulled all of this material together. So
he was kind of embodying his archive, right? In his dress and
yeah,
performance of it
yes,
all.
and so they were their archive in a way. So yeah, no, I had fun. Thank you.
That seems like a really fun way to end on. Unless anyone else has any final thoughts or questions for Bergit before we kind of draw it to a close formally, but not completely, because there are drinks upstairs, but I'll talk about that more in a moment. But does anyone else have anything else they wanted to ask before I wrap it up? Or we can continue the discussion upstairs. One more, and then we will wrap it up.
Thank you so much for the talk. It's really wonderful. Some of the words that were coming up in archives is like retracing, reacquainting, revisiting, returning. And I really love this word, remembering. And I was wondering, Bergit, if during the process of doing all the research on archives, maybe the body, maybe the land, maybe any documents, photography, was there something that you found within the process that you were remembering, like personally through the process? And is there any form of, you know, within the research going into remembering parts of looking at the landscapes and seeing something through there that was worth for you remember?
Yeah. It's I think some of the fieldwork reminded me how much I actually liked walking the landscape, and I grew up near by the North Sea, and it's very tidal. I come from, and I just Yeah, it reminded me how much I like the imperfections of that, of something coming and going, and there's just some acceptance of a dynamism, of a dynamic situation, which I think also reminds me very much of, makes me very close to archives, because there is relooking at archives, you always see something different, and we've always got different lenses. And in the same time, that was also the editing process for this book in a way. As you pointed out, there's one chapter at the end, but it then rejigs everything else, and everything else has to be reviewed. And so there's a sort of a tidal wave that goes through the whole book. So that's maybe my answer to you at the moment.
Okay, lovely, thank you. I'm aware that we're kind of just after time, and I know people have to go. But if you don't have to rush off, we are serving drinks upstairs in the cafe on the 3rd floor. But before we all go up there, I just wanted to say a few final words. First of all, a plug for the book. That Routledge are offering a 20% discount on the book. Is that this evening or just generally?
If you pick up a flyer this evening,
Ah,
you've got
pick
6
up a
months to
flyer.
spend, and you've got the flyer somewhere. Yeah.
Pick up a flyer. And I also just want to really kind of end by thanking all our contributors tonight, especially Bergit for this, the occasion of bringing this all together, but also Lucy Bradnock and Beatrice von Bismarck for your contributions as well, and to Liz Wells as well for being here to talk about the series, and of course to all of you for coming and asking great questions and kind of celebrating with us, and also to Matilda, our student helper, thank you very, very much, and Research Forum as well. So please give us a round of applause and